The Palm Sunday story has its roots in the Old Testament. There are three passages I'm going to mention. The first one was at the end of the reign of King David. David had said that he would be followed by his son Solomon. Another of his children, by the name of Adonijah, thought otherwise. Adonijah invited a lot of people to a big feast, and the intention was to announce that he would be the new king. Solomon's mother, Bathsheba, went to King David and very politely inquired whether Adonijah had King David's authority. No, was the answer, and David gave an order that Solomon was to go to Zadok, a priest, and Nathan, prophet, to be crowned as king of Israel. And he was to go to them riding on David's mule. Now the point of that was not that it was a mule, but it was King David's mule. But we can see from that a mule was good enough for King David to ride on. It wasn't that down market a form of transport. Another relevant episode comes in 2 Kings. It was a sequence of events started by the prophet Elisha. He sent a young prophet off to a gathering of army commanders where one commander, Jehu, was meeting with others. The prophet turns up, tells Commander Jehu that he's got a message for him and needs to give it in private. So as soon as he gets Jehu alone, he doesn't give him a message, he anoints him king of Israel on Elisha's instructions. Well, Jehu joins the other officers, they ask what's happened, and when they get it out of him, they promptly throw their cloaks on the ground in front of him. That action of throwing cloaks on the ground was recognizing that he was the king and giving him honor. And that, of course, is a forerunner of people throwing their cloaks in front of Jesus as he was riding into Jerusalem. But the really significant bit from the Old Testament is in Zechariah, chapter 9 and verse 9. I'm going to read it. Rejoice greatly, O daughter Zion. Shout aloud, O daughter Jerusalem. Lo, your king comes to you. Triumphant and victorious is he, humble and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. He will cut off the chariot from Ephraim, and the war horse from Jerusalem, and the battle bow shall cut off, and he shall command peace to the nations. Well, as far as 4-legged things go, there's an obvious contrast between the king riding a donkey and the enemies of Jerusalem coming with horse-drawn chariots and war horses. But read the prophecy as a whole. Jesus is quite clearly fulfilling it. Jesus was making a statement. He is the God-given king, and he was entitled to come into Jerusalem in that manner. But you then get into the question of, well, was Jesus being particularly humble, using a donkey rather than something grander like a big horse? Or was he being triumphant? Well, what I get out of the story is that Jesus didn't do anything to impress people by giving himself a good appearance or riding on a showy form of transport. But what the story does show is the recognition and acceptance of Jesus as King. It's the difference between, "Ooh, aren't I great, look at me," and finding people are clapping and applauding because they already know who the person is. The Isaiah passage was one of several in which Isaiah refers to a coming deliverer who is not very clearly defined in Isaiah, but is a deliverer who is not a victorious hero figure, but who gets ill-treated. We call them the suffering servant songs, and we recognize them as pointing to Jesus. In the Philippians passage, Paul is saying something a bit similar. Although Jesus was entitled to status, he didn't insist on it. And quite the opposite, he was obedient to his Father right up to the point of going to the cross. Now, all of this is relevant in showing us who Jesus was, who Jesus is, who it is that we believe in. But I'm going to say something more about what Paul was doing. Paul wasn't just teaching theology here. What he was saying to the Philippians and to us today is that we should be following Christ's example. The appointed readings start at Philippians chapter 2, verse 5. If I go back just one verse, I see Paul writing, "Let each of you look not to your own interests, but to the interests of others." And then in verse 5, right at the beginning of the appointed reading, it begins, "Let the same mind be in you that was in Christ Jesus." Now, this business of being mindful of others rather than yourself is a bit countercultural. Self-help books are a big industry. There's a lot of teaching about being self-confident, about standing up for yourself, about how to complain effectively if you get trampled on by big corporate. And I suppose some bits are just quite openly how to push your own agenda. Now, I'm not saying that's all wrong. I'm not saying it's completely wrong. Jesus, when he was the human Jesus, was a very self-confident figure. For most of his time on earth, he took charge. Jesus was clearly the leader. It was Jesus who set the agenda. Or, well, there were occasions when it stopped being his agenda and events took over. When people asked for healing, well, it didn't take Jesus very long to heal them, but he did it on the spot. They weren't told to come back later. And there was one episode where Jesus' agenda just went out of the window. I'm thinking of the story of feeding the 5,000. That day had started off as Jesus trying to give his disciples a bit of a rest, a day off. They go off across the lake to a quiet spot. And Jesus finds, when he gets there, there's a large crowd desperately wanting to hear from him. So Jesus looked to their interests and gave up on his own plan for the day. You can see the two sides to it, and they're not irreconcilable. It's looking to other people's interests, but not being so self-effacing as to be nobody. I think what I get out of this is two questions which can be a bit awkward. in almost any situation I find myself in, I think I ought to ask, what would Jesus say about this? And also, a question that's got asked a number of times, what would Jesus do? As I said, Paul was trying to tell us to look to other people's interests and to be imitators of Jesus. Lord, I pray that you will help us to do just that.